Hey guys, welcome back to Tactical Tangents with Mike and Jim. So the guest that we have tonight stopped an active shooter who had an AK variant with a drum magazine from 68 yards away with his pistol. Now, I don't care who you are. If you stop a guy with an AK from 68 yards away with a pistol, you're a certified badass. That's all there is to that. Before we get into that, though, Jim and I want to announce our new partnership we got going with Right On Optics. Right On Optics is our new sponsor. They've got red dots, rifle scopes, binoculars. You could go to rightonoptics.com, use the discount code TacTangents, get 15% off. Now, you have to know going into this that we would not be partnering with anybody just to bring commercials to try to make some money, okay? That's not what this is about. We believe in their products. They believe in us, and so we're working together to support each other, and that's awesome. If you go to their website, rightonoptics.com, use the discount code TacTangents to get 15% off. You can also apply for their public safety, law enforcement, military pricing. If you do that, there's a comments field. Still make sure that they know that we sent you so that they can kind of keep track of where these referrals are coming from. But we're excited. We're going to get more into those guys a little bit later. But for now, we want to get into the guest. Jim, what you got?
911, is this reference shots being fired on Fairchild base?
Yes, it is. The hospital. There's a crazy guy out here shooting with an automatic weapon.
Hospital.
Ma'am?
Okay.
It's
All right.
one individual. All I got to see was a weapon. Looks like an AK-47.
Fairchild 6, shot fired. I took him down. He's down. Police 6, he's down. Fairchild Police 1, Police 2. This individual is still in the hospital. He's firing off rounds. Copy. 2 people are down.
Fairchild Police 6, I shot him. He's down.
Roger, that's 6.
All right, let's get into it. So on this episode, we have a guy who is as credible as it gets. In 1994, a young man who had been kicked out of the Air Force for psych problems returned to his home base, Fairchild Air Force Base near Spokane, Washington, and shot up the base hospital. His shooting continued for several minutes across the grounds of the hospital until a young security force policeman, so like a military police for the Air Force, on bike patrol, made it to the scene and engaged him with his issued M9 Beretta 9mm service pistol. Andy Brown, who was the security force's airman, made a headshot on that mass murderer and stopped him cold in his tracks. And tonight, we have Andy on the show. Sir, it's a real privilege to get to talk to you. You wrote a book about your experiences called Warnings Unheeded, which I strongly recommend. It tells the story of the hospital shooting as well as a notorious B-52 bomber crash that happened at the same base almost immediately after. So welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, guys. It's good to be here.
Awesome. We'll get right into the questions and we'll kind of go from there. Can you give us a brief rundown of the two tragedies you wrote about?
Sure. The book not only covers my experience as a security policeman, but also the men and women who recognized the precursors of violence and tragedy and tried to prevent it. The first incident, over a period of several years, the airman that you mentioned, he exhibited odd behavior and was referred to mental health doctors in basic training in his tech school and at 2 of his duty stations. And those doctors recommended his discharge from the military and follow-up care in mental health facilities in the civilian world. But each time they recommended that, they were overruled.
Yeah. You say odd behavior. I'm just going to interrupt you there with, I'm in the military. I've met a lot of weird people in the military. When you say odd, can you kind of give us an idea or an example just how odd this guy got while he was active duty?
Sure. In basic training, he just didn't fit in, wasn't adapting well to military life, and was uptight and tense and nervous enough to alert his TI that he needed a mental health evaluation. And the behavioral analysis services there, they diagnosed him with anxiety disorder and recommended he be discharged from the Air Force. And the training superintendent there also agreed with that, but the leadership at the basic training overruled him, and his behavior got even more odd and worse as he progressed through his career, to include openly masturbating in front of his roommate and his roommate's girlfriend. He expressed a desire to go back to his high school and kill his classmates. he was threatened by benign comments that his roommates would make. Like his roommate joked that he was going to break an alarm clock because it ticked so loudly it kept him awake at night, and he joked about throwing it out the window. And so the guy started stalking his roommate, following him around, and felt that his career was in jeopardy because this guy threatened to break his clock. And when his roommate complained about him masturbating, he felt that was a threat to his career, and he just obsessed over it. He also was obsessed with death. And later on in his career, he confessed to a girl that he considered his girlfriend that he wanted to go out with a bang and pay back some people that he felt had done him wrong, and basically expressed a desire to kill people. So that odd behavior is kind of understating it. But
I think one of the interesting parts about that is there are some specific details that you talk about, that kind of, this was back in the 90s. I mean, this was pre-Columbine. Columbine was one of those incidents that was notorious when it came to active shooters, and it brought a lot of attention to it. And this was before that. I think I would like to think that society has come a long way in some of those red flags. One of the things that stood out to me in the book, though, was at various times the guy was actually fairly coherent enough to communicate certain things. At some point when he was facing, treatment and ultimately discharge, he wrote a letter to Congress, and the way it's described in the book, the letter actually sounds pretty coherent, which would make, an outsider who doesn't know the guy seem like, like maybe he's not that big of a problem. Does that jive with kind of your understanding of the guy?
Yeah, sometimes he was coherent, especially in his writing, but at other times he hardly could make sense. And I think he was more clear in his writing than in person, and he may have also had some help writing those letters to his congressman and such. But some of the doctors that diagnosed him and dealt with him, he spent 90 days on a psychiatric ward at Wilford Hall, a military hospital in Texas. And some of the doctors said that he was more in touch with reality than most schizophrenic people that she had seen, but that he definitely exhibited signs or symptoms of having paranoid schizophrenia.
And just to go back into the synopsis of events, he ultimately showed enough signs to enough people over the course of years that the Air Force got around to discharging him. And he was effectively kicked out of the Air Force for psych reasons, and then came back to the hospital. Can you kind of pick us up there as far as what transpired at the hospital that day?
Sure. He had left Fairchild and went to Wilford Hall, and then was discharged from there and sent to another base where they, like you said, they kicked him out there. But he had by then fixated on the two doctors at Fairchild and returned to Spokane to pay them back for what he considered that they had ruined his career. So he was going to seek vengeance with a rifle. And he entered the annex building of Fairchild's hospital, which contained the mental health facility, with an AK-47 variant. And he walked down the hallway and entered the two doctors' offices, one after another, and shot them in the chest, and then continued through the hospital, firing indiscriminately at the men, women, and children who were present there.
And how did you at the time, if I understand, were at the main gate of the base?
Yes, I was on bike patrol that day. I was normally a motorized patrolman, but I just started a newly implemented bike patrol, and I'd finished patrolling the housing areas on the base and had headed to the back gate. At the time, the hospital was located outside of the perimeter fence. So I was preparing to go outside the perimeter and patrol the housing areas that were on either side of the hospital. So I'd stopped at the back gate to sit in the air conditioning for a second and talk with the gate guard when the call came over the radio, reporting a individual in the hospital running around with a shotgun. The first individuals who called in the incident had misidentified the weapon as a shotgun, but it got the patrols headed that way. So I responded from the back gate, which was about 0.3 of a mile away down a straight road, straight shot to the hospital.
And so I want to just, before we get into obviously your role in this, I want to look just kind of from a doctrine standpoint. I mentioned that this was pre-Columbine, and for at least civilian law enforcement, as a police officer myself, I know that Columbine was very pivotal in a shift in doctrine when it came to active shooter response. It was all about, containing and isolating a problem and trying to communicate your way out of this. And obviously that has changed. Now the active shooter response is all about stopping the killing from happening, closing with and killing the person who's running around with a rifle or a gun or knife, whatever it might be. This was prior to that. Was that a common doctrinal thing among Air Force security forces, or was that just kind of your assessment of the problem and your response to it?
Yeah, it's interesting. It did happen prior to Columbine and prior to even the coining of the phrase active shooter or active killer. So these incidents had been happening long before that, but it took Columbine to get them into the forefront of everybody's mind. But up to that point, I had never even considered responding to an active shooter incident. I considered responding to lethal threats and what I would do, and tried to prepare myself for it. But having pre-planned what I would do in an active shooter incident, it had never crossed my mind that somebody would just, for no reason, for seemingly no reason, go into a facility and start shooting people. But my prior planning did prepare me to just go and seek out the threat and terminate it if I could. So that's what I was doing. Was when I heard that there was an individual at the hospital with a shotgun, I imagined myself responding there and seeking out the threat. And when I was pedaling to the scene, there was a crowd of people coming out of the hospital annex and running down the road toward me. And I didn't have a description of the shooter, but I could tell that they were running away from a threat. So I scanned them and didn't see that they were a danger. So I rode through the crowd and was asking them, "Where is he?" And they all pointed behind themselves and collectively said, "There's a man with a gun shooting people. He's over there." So I rode through the crowd. I was still in the middle of the road, and I was listening for the gunfire, or I heard the gunfire. It was reverberating off the buildings. There was a housing area to my left and the hospital buildings to my right. And I didn't immediately see the source of the gunfire, but as I rode further a little bit, there was an individual that appeared in the middle of the road, dressed in dark clothing, and had a rifle at his hip, and it was firing to his left and his right. So I veered right and rode up onto a sidewalk and dumped the bike and went into a kneeling position and drew my Beretta and yelled at him to drop his weapon, and he refused and pointed in my direction, and I returned fire and fired 4 rounds, and witnesses say that one of the first 3 rounds, if not the first round, hit him in the shoulder, and then in the 4th round hit him between the eyes, and he immediately dropped to the ground and didn't move after that.
That's an incredible shot, man. I applaud your actions that day, not only in how you responded to dealing with that guy, but I noticed in your book that you talked about how you had rehearsed these sorts of things, and you mentioned it a minute ago, how you've rehearsed responding to different types of lethal encounters.
Off-duty training.
And off-duty training, and also a lot of dry fire practice. And I think it says a lot about the kind of person that you are, not only that you were able to go charging after this guy, but also the days that you lived, up to that moment, preparing for, your duty. That says a lot about you. And I want to talk a little bit about that mentality, every day that you spent dry fire practicing or doing rehearsals or training for, what most cops would just call the big one. Can you walk us through kind of your mindset in training and how you prepared for that?
Sure. I didn't feel that the training that we received in the military up to that point had prepared me for anything that I imagined I might encounter. So I sought out as much training as I could. This was prior to the internet, so it was not easy to find any additional training sources, but I subscribed to Police Magazine and read their articles, and I eventually found the books by Charles Remsburg from Caliber Press, the Street Survival series. And in that book, the one by Charles Remsburg, I learned one of the most valuable things that I still use to this day, which is mental rehearsal, where every day before I would go to sleep, I would visually imagine a lethal force scenario that I might encounter and vividly see myself, all the movements and responses that I would do, like seeking cover and drawing the pistol and pressing the trigger back, and just as vividly as I possibly could. And if I saw that one of these tactics that I was mentally rehearsing wasn't ideal, I would kind of back up and reconsider it and rehearse something different that would have a more positive outcome. And I think that way, when I actually did have a lethal force encounter, it wasn't a shock to me. It wasn't the first time I was encountering it, and I didn't have to hesitate and think what I would do, because I had rehearsed similar incidents and similar situations. So there was no, I didn't have to stop and waste any time thinking about it. I just reacted. And I attribute the mental rehearsal that I had done for years prior to that as being a crucial aspect of how I survived that incident.
Based on your personal experience with that, what advice would you give someone like a young cop getting ready to go into the world and concerned about active shooters?
And just to add on to that question, just a little bit of perspective here, that you were 24 years old at the time,
yes.
Correct?
Yeah, I was 24 years old, and I had just come back from a 3-year overseas tour. So as soon as I got to Fairchild, I had turned 21 overseas, where I was old enough to buy my own personal handgun, but couldn't own one over there. I was over in Greece. But as soon as I got back to the States, I went out and bought a Taurus M9 clone so that I could practice with it off duty. And like you were saying, I did a lot of dry fire practice when I couldn't get out and shoot actual rounds. But I also would go out in the woods and practice long range shooting, basically just shooting at pop cans and pine cones. But I think that also helped quite a bit in being able to make that shot. As far as my advice to young security policemen on regarding active shooters would be, if you don't think that your current firearms training has prepared you enough for anything you might encounter, especially an active shooter where longer distance shooting is more common than shooting you might get involved in on a traffic stop, I would recommend getting a firearm that matches the one you carry on duty, and go out and seek some training. Not only shoot on your own, but go seek out some professional training from a range that's near you.
I'm going to editorialize on that real quick. It drives me crazy that you should have to. That as a young airman making not much money, you have to go spend your own money to buy your own gun, your own bullets, to make up for training gaps. That drives me crazy.
Yeah, it's frustrating, but it's not just the military or the Air Force. The civilian police force doesn't get the training that they should be getting either.
Yeah, I can confirm that.
You and your team at Fairchild performed incredibly well that day, especially given how early in the public consciousness this was. You know, the fact that, like you said, there wasn't even the term active shooter. Can you tell us about what you think made it work so well? For example, your communications with your dispatch, and any lessons or critiques you have about the base's performance that day. One of the things you mentioned in the book, for example, is how well the medics performed.
Yeah, we never did practice active shooter incidents, but the security police were pretty used to dealing with adversity. Our radios never worked, so when we were having communication problems, it was just par for the course. And they're also pretty used to adapting and overcoming, and improvising. So when we couldn't communicate with the troops that are on the scene, we would relay messages back and forth through the law enforcement desk, that type of thing. But they did a lot of things right, and for such a chaotic scene. It worked out pretty smoothly. Some things that we could have learned, or that we should have learned from that incident in particular, is to have had access to master keys to make searching and clearing the buildings, especially the annex, which was an old 3-story dormitory that most of the doors were locked because people had barricaded themselves behind the solid wooden doors there. So it took a lot longer than it should have to clear that building, and that delayed the ambulances getting into the scene to help assist with the wounded. Thankfully, this incident happened in a hospital where there was a lot of trained medical personnel, but getting them down to civilian hospitals where they could receive more immediate care took longer than it needed to because it took so long to clear the scene. But they did an amazing job. There was only a handful of on-duty security policemen that day to respond, but it ended up 55 total law enforcement and security specialists responded that day. Just when off-duty cops heard about the incident, they responded to the desk and armed up and headed to the scene without having to be recalled. For the newer security policemen that don't remember or don't realize that the career field used to be split up into law enforcement specialists and security specialists, so that's how it was back then. Now I understand it's a combined career field.
And that's still a big part of the, as I understand it, the ethos of security forces is that dual identity of half the time you're a cop and half the time you're a base defense ground force. I'm going to shift gears on us. You did a great job deep diving the murderer's personal and medical history. It's one of the most detailed case studies on a mass murderer I've ever seen anywhere. I have a lot of follow-on questions to it. And one of the big ones is, what would you say to people who assume any given mass murderer just snapped or was bullied? Was this guy bullied? Did he just snap?
I'd say stop watching the TV, because that's probably where you hear that term used most of the time, is the person just snapped and nobody could have predicted this type of violence, that kind of thing. There's, in every case that I've looked at, or at least nearly everyone, there's always been signs that the perpetrator had planned or prepared for this attack in advance. And there's usually someone who knew the subject and knew, or should have known, that they were a potential threat. So I would say that the majority of them don't just snap. There's always been something that led up to it. And as far as being bullied, I know that seems to be a common factor in some of the people who commit these crimes. I don't know if it's a deciding factor. Maybe the behavior that the person exhibits, if they're an introvert or something, maybe that is a reason why people are picking on them or bullying them. But there's a lot of people that get bullied that don't end up committing this type of crime. So it could just be the personality trait of the people who tend to commit these acts might also lead them to be picked on in school.
That's an interesting what came first, the chicken or the egg debate kind of thing. I think that's a good point. You mentioned in there something about the media, and one of the things that I see all the time in law enforcement is those instances where the media tends to get it wrong, or the public wants a bunch of answers and it's just not available yet. And so we have to start filling that narrative with something. And you spoke a little bit about the media's response to this shooting. Can you give us a sense of what kinds of things the media got wrong here?
Well, it's weird when you read in the book and you see all of these traits and behaviors of the perpetrator that committed the crime, and you see all of these people who are jumping up and down saying this guy's a threat, he's going to come to our workplace and kill us, and the psychiatrist is warning his family that this is the kind of person who could come back in 1 year or 20 years from now and kill me and my family. And just left and right, there are people that are seeing these traits and behaviors and warning authorities. And then the crime happens, and hours later on the news, the reporter is there exclaiming that this is the worst mass murder attack in Spokane history, and that nobody saw it coming, and what could have prompted this guy to have just snapped and come to the base with a rifle. I don't know if they do it to sensationalize it and drum up more fear, or if they're just being lazy and trying to be first to the scene and don't know what else to say, so they say the first thing that comes to their mind. But it seems to be a common theme where they try to pass it off like nobody could have predicted it.
Yeah. What advice would you give a young staff sergeant or a young lieutenant who has a guy who's showing these red flag signs? What can they do? What should they do?
If they're concerned about a person that they supervise or somebody that they work with, they should report that behavior and follow up on it if they don't feel like anything is being done, or that if they don't feel that enough is being done. And they should try to learn to recognize the traits and behaviors of a potentially violent person so that they can go to their leadership armed with knowledge and not just say, I'm afraid this guy's going to hurt somebody, but be able to articulate that why they believe he's a threat.
Speaking of being able to articulate things like that, well, there's two things. I think one thing that you get from reading the book, obviously, is you have, and I don't even know if you could quantify the amount of research that you put into compiling all this into a book. I'm sure it took a substantial amount of time. But when you read it now that it's in this neat little package, you spend your time going through this book and just realizing like, oh my gosh, yeah, I mean, obviously this is the, this is the guy. And probably what makes it difficult is the snapshots that each individual person is getting. And if people spoke about those things, maybe it would reach people and maybe they can kind of piece together the right picture that they need. But I think it's interesting, and it's something to definitely keep in perspective that, when you meet somebody or you work with somebody, like in Jim's example, the staff sergeant, that's dealing with a problem child or whatever, and you say, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if this guy did X. Well, you're probably not the first person to have thought something like that. And I think that's a big deal. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, but I also want to know your assessment of this guy's mother and what role you think she played in this. There was a very interesting dynamic occurring there.
Yes, there was, absolutely. As far as the snapshots, there was this case is kind of unique in that there were people all over the place that had a piece of the puzzle, and they all suspected that he might be a threat and it might be dangerous. Part of the problem was that he was moved around so much that they couldn't all report those suspicions to one central authority, and they couldn't get the whole big picture. There were certain individuals who had enough to where they...
And that's a common militaryism, is that it's very, very difficult to fire people, but one thing we can do is move them, usually.
Yep, absolutely. There was enough pieces of the puzzle in enough locations where they had enough to act and still failed to do so. But if they'd have had all of the pieces, I think it would have been more clear to enough people where they could have taken some action more than they did in the first place. But there were some people who actually, like at the base where he was at right before he was discharged, there was an individual there who was jumping up and down telling his supervisors, this guy's going to come to our workshop with a rifle and he's going to kill people. He went so far as to get permission not to allow him to be trained on the firearm or on the rifle at that base. They were afraid of him enough to restrict him from firearms access, but not enough to get him seen by any mental health doctors, any more than just to get him removed from the military. But there was also people who thought that he was harmless and didn't see any threats in him. So what was the rest of your question?
It was about the mom. Like, the mom played an interesting role in that whole thing, and especially when we talk about the snapshots, and certainly, as you mentioned, people had enough information to act, but then you have mom in the background constantly enabling. I feel like, And I'm sure that there is a, mom's blinded by love for her son and stuff, but at what point is it just blindly complicit,
Yeah, there were some people that said that she was quite meddling and overbearing, and there was a point when he was at the psychiatric ward where he was about convinced to accept his discharge and go home and go to school and find a new career. And then when Mom showed up, he turned down that medical evaluation board recommendation to get out and started to fight to stay in the military again, which ended up not being so good, but it had a lot to do with Mom's influence over him and his desire to make her happy, and he felt that he would be letting her down if he gave up on his military career. So that she did play a big part, according to several of the doctors and people who interacted with her.
I think that's a important thing to understand. If and again, I know it's hard for if you see a loved one who is going through a hard time or dealing with mental illness, it might be a difficult place to be, but you have to understand that in a lot of ways, you're kind of the centerpiece. You have the most stable understanding of that person's situation. And had Mom had maybe a different outlook, maybe this thing could have been prevented. I don't know. I hate to stretch, and I'm certainly not blaming her, but I think it's good food for thought.
Well, I have a side note on that, if you'll allow. I recently had a mom contact me about whether she could help her son get into the Air Force, even though he was diagnosed autistic or lightly on the spectrum. And she was trying to figure out if there was a waiver, exception to policy, or something like that. And for one, you should be getting yourself into the military in a job like that. Parents really shouldn't be involved for the most part. And two, I asked her if this person could handle stress well and whether she was going to help him or hurt him by encouraging to go into this very stressful environment that is basic training and ultimately the military. And she was just kind of blinded by, well, that's where the track she wanted him on, and didn't understand that maybe she was setting him up for a bad outcome.
Yikes.
Right. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Andy, can you tell us how the Air Force treated you after the attack?
Sure. I was going through a lot of self-doubt about my response. Some people have a hard time understanding that, but I think a lot of people second-guess their response even when when the outcome was favorable. I had a lot of guilt about the people that were killed and wounded on my watch, and felt that wondered if I could have gotten there quicker, if I could have saved some more lives. And I had a hard time getting a hold of the audio tape that would have helped me figure out my response time. There was a lot of sensory
distortions,
like auditory exclusion and time distortion. Yeah, I didn't know how long it took me to get to the scene. It felt like it took forever. So I was doing a little second guessing, like I said. And it took me like 14 years to get a copy of the audio tape where I found out that it only took me 2 minutes to get to the scene and stop the shooter from the time that I got the radio call to the time that I radioed in that he was down. But in between that time, I was having some post-traumatic stress symptoms. I developed some anxiety and irritability, and wanted to seek some counseling just to see if I was dealing with the aftermath normally. And the first psychologist that I spoke with, a civilian, she said, yeah, you're dealing with it good. And it felt good to talk to her. But then when my command found out that I was talking to a shrink, they pulled my duty weapon and relieved me of duty. So I told the doctor that I was dealing with it fine and asked her to write a letter to my command so I could go back to work in patrol. And so I just kind of swallowed those emotions and feelings that I was having and pressed on, and that just allowed those symptoms to grow a little bit stronger over time and until they started to affect my work. And then when I sought counseling again, I was again relieved of duty, and I again decided to eat it and just stuff those feelings down and continue with my job until it really started to affect my personal life and my professional life. And then I decided I had to get out of the military in order to try to find some peace and greater mental health. But the Air Force was doing what they were trained to do at the time, and I don't have any hard feelings for them. I just hope that they would learn from my experience and not just indiscriminately relieve somebody of duty just because they're going to talk to a psychologist. On the other side of that, they also praised and awarded me. It wasn't just go back to work and don't see a psychologist. They thought they were doing the right thing by giving me an airman's medal and doing award ceremonies, that kind of thing.
I think it's and hopefully it's come a long way. I know at least locally for me, for my department, at various times, for work stuff, we've had officers that have had to go talk to our department psychologist, and she's been a great help to a lot of people. And I've been to her. I've got several close friends who have been to her, and I hope that since that time, the stigma of getting help and talking about these things has gotten better. I imagine that it has. I can't obviously speak for what the Air Force has done. I know locally we seem to do pretty well, but hopefully if there are people out there and they're listening to this and they're thinking, man, I would like to talk about some of these issues that I'm having after a stressful or traumatic incident, they can get out there and do it, because it does help a lot. And Andy, I can empathize at least a little bit about dealing with some stressful situations and needing to talk about it. Obviously not maybe to this degree, but hopefully that's gotten better. I really hope it has.
Yeah, I hope so. The feelings and the symptoms are all pretty similar, even if the situations that cause them might be of different varying degrees. It's still something you need to address and get fixed and be able to talk about.
Absolutely.
So with that experience of being in the Air Force and ultimately having to leave the Air Force after the attack, what are you doing these days?
Well, for one, I'm doing a lot better mentally. I've finally found some help through the VA and other programs. So I've worked through the majority of the issues I was having and went back to work in a law enforcement type field. I work for Homeland Security here in Spokane. I work in an armed position, but it's not very exciting. It's just behind a desk. So I don't really get to go out and deal with the bad guys or anything anymore, but it's a good job. I like the people I work with, and I still get to shoot guns. So that's good. And I'm married and have a
nice
son and daughter, and still living in the Spokane area.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to hear that for sure. There's one last thing about the shooting that I want to ask about, because this comes up, and I think if we're talking to a crowd who might ever be confronted with an active shooter. My wife one time was at work, and they had like a going away party for somebody, and they had a bunch of balloons. And so my wife thought it would be real funny. Not actually, let me take that back. She didn't think it would be funny. She just didn't think about it when it was time to go like pick up from the party, and she just went around and started popping balloons. No thought really to it. But she works in a building full of law enforcement, and one of the police supervisors that was there kind of pokes his head out, and he's like, I thought someone was shooting the place up. And, it was like, well, if you really thought someone was shooting the place up, I imagine you would have come out in a little bit different posture. But that came up in the book. It talks about how people just kind of dismissed it and thought, oh, it's just doors slamming closed. And someone actually said like, oh, it sounds like gunfire. It's tricky because you don't want to jump out to every loud noise that you hear and go running crazy like it's a shooter, but at the same time, there's always going to be that kind of delay where you think to yourself, what was that? And then you realize what was happening. Have you come up with any good mental posture that you think people should adopt for if you hear something like that? I think the best one
maybe gunfire, but not for sure.
Yeah, for me, the best advice I've ever come up with is just don't be dismissive. Have that dialogue with yourself where you challenge it and you go out and you check on it. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're on the right track there. Just don't let yourself talk yourself out of that and being complacent. I think most of the people who are listening to your show are probably familiar with the sound of gunfire. So just be aware of it. And if you hear sounds that are similar to it, at least that chief that you're talking about went and investigated it instead of staying in his office and just assuming it was balloons.
Yeah. See, and I told my wife afterwards, I kind of scolded her for it, like, why would you do that? And she's like, I didn't even, just the thought that she doesn't think the way, she thinks like a normal person, maybe not like some of us. But I also think that you mentioned earlier the mental rehearsals thing. And if you're a survival oriented or law enforcement oriented or self-defense oriented type of person, going through that process and imagining something like this, I think that's got to be kind of part of your, I guess, catalog, is that initial reaction or initial response when you start to think that maybe something like that's going on. And before Jim changes gears on us to the B-52 crash, I just want to remind guys that or gals that might be listening to this that are early in their law enforcement career that this was, I know we've got a lot of listeners that are cops and especially new and young cops. Mr. Brown was 24 years old at the time of this incident. He was several years into a military career, but consider that, a lot of cops, when they get into it, are pretty young, and they're not necessarily taking their own initiative to do those mental rehearsals and to go out and train on their own and do all those things. And I imagine that a large portion of the success, and Andy, it sounds like you credit a lot of the success that day to those things. You have to do that on your own. You have to be a self-starter. That's a lot of people are not going to do that for you. A lot of agencies and departments are not going to do it for you. So keep that in mind as you progress through your career. Jim, you want to get into the crash?
Yeah. So the story of Czar 5-2, that story is taught to basically every officer in the Air Force. I know I personally learned about it in formal training at the Air Force Academy and then again at pilot training, and I probably have come across that story formally at least a half dozen times in my career. It is the case study on leadership integrity, crew resource management, which is how we operate as a team on the aircraft, and adherence to standards, and kind of a classic case about loyalty to the service versus loyalty to the bro network. Now, for those not familiar, and shortly after the Fairchild Hospital shooting, a B-52 which is our biggest heavy bomber, was preparing for an air show, and while it was preparing for the air show, the aircraft commander, pilot in command, rolled the wings way too much bank. I don't know the actual bank angle, but it was substantial to the point where the wings weren't pulling the airplane up. The wings were pulling the airplane sideways and ultimately down. So nothing was holding the airplane up, and the airplane got in a turning stall and crashed. Killed everyone on board and turned into a fireball. And so if all you do is see the video, that's what it looks like. But it turns out there was a big backstory to it. And Andy, can you talk us through a little bit of the backstory behind it?
Sure. There was a pilot at Fairchild, and even prior to his time at Fairchild, he was very talented. He had like 5,000 hours in a B-52, including some combat time in Vietnam. And he flew that plane like it was a single-engine jet fighter. Like you were saying, he would not only on training missions, but during air shows and air show practices, he would go screaming down the flight line and pitch the nose up like 85 degrees or more and rocket the plane up in the sky. And then right before it would fall back on itself, he would do a wing over and gain some altitude and pull out of that maneuver. And he also would do low and slow turns over the base and over populated areas and bank the wings close to 90 degrees. And right before stall, he would pull out of the bank and fly out of it. But he was just known for flying very aggressively and low level and slow.
So he was... Yeah, there are aspects of his personality and his flying and his professional approach that the Air Force wants and needs and likes, right? We want and need and like aggressive pilots, guys who are going to know exactly what their limits are and exactly what the aircraft's limits are, and when necessary, go right to those limits. And so there are things that we like about that. And in a lot of ways, he was a hot shot and a very well-respected pilot. But then, there's a fine line where you get into reckless and stupid. And sometimes that's a judgment call. And right there were different views about whether he was right at the line or way past the line.
Sure. Banking the wings 90 degrees at 5,000 feet is a lot different than doing that at 100 feet off the ground. You don't leave yourself any room for error or recovery.
So what do you think this guy's deal was? I mean, being aggressive and all that, like Jim said, are attributes that maybe the Air Force is looking for to some degree, but this guy got the attention of just about anyone he flew with. And there was some, he had some high-ranking friends that would let him keep getting away with it, and they would kind of give him what he wanted. But again, we go back to those red flags. Anyone that flew with this guy was afraid to be around him. What do you think his issue was?
Well, I got the information that I have from the people that were stationed with him and who flew with him, not only from interviews that I did, but also from interviews that I found in a report of investigation. And the consensus seems to be that he was very good, but he liked to demonstrate how good he was and show his superiority in the aircraft, and pushed the limits and violated the safety standards. So I think he was, from what I understand, people said that he was arrogant and cocky, but also, like I said, liked to demonstrate how good he was in the aircraft. And he had gotten away with it for so long that he kind of probably felt that he was invincible and didn't think that he would ever push it beyond what he could control. But eventually he did.
So you can see how there are some mind traps there a little bit as far as behaviors and attitudes that we like to an extent. And then when it gets past that threshold, that arrogance that makes you push yourself to the edge is good. And then it becomes the weakness and vulnerability that kills you. And learning how to ride that line, I think, is an important thing for a young professional in a job like law enforcement, military, the tactical world. And shifting on that, one of the heroes of that mishap was the guy flying as co-pilot, Colonel Mark McGeehan. Can you tell us about his role in the story?
Sure. There was a lot of air crews, a lot of the crew members, such as the navigators and radar navs and the E-dubs. They were complaining to their superiors that this guy was dangerous, and they were trying to get him grounded. But nobody was really listening to him, and nobody wanted to take it up the chain of command until Colonel Mark McGeehan became the squadron commander of the 92nd Bomb Squadron. And when people saw that he took command, they trusted him and knew he was a straight shooter, so they took their concerns to him as a new commander. And he had already seen or was aware of the way this pilot was flying and had intended to do something about it. And when his men started coming to him complaining about recent flights that they had been on that had terrified them, he decided to go up his chain of command and get this pilot grounded. And he did, and he thought he had the cooperation of his boss, but then it come to find out that it seemed like after his boss agreed to have him grounded, then that boss talked to the pilot and got convinced otherwise, and told Mark McGeehan that this pilot will continue to fly and pretty much nothing you can do about it. So Mark McGeehan was upset, but he said, okay, if he's going to fly, then none of my men are going to fly with him. And if anybody has to be his co-pilot, I'll do it. So he was on board the plane the day that it crashed when it was practicing for an upcoming air show. He told his men to stay off of the plane, and in their place, he flew on a ZAR 52 on the day of the crash.
For anyone who's curious, why didn't he, at the time of the crash, stop it? I personally had this happen in a simulator once, where I was the pilot not flying, the pilot flying, accidentally rolled us upside down in a big airplane. And it was amazing how fast it happened. And that's one of the things about airplanes is you can go from everything's normal to everything's way not normal really fast. And in the time it took me to say overbank, I have the airplane, I was saying I have as we got the red screen of death on the simulator. And that was one of the lessons I took from it as a young aviator was it is amazing how fast it happens. So if you were sitting down with a group of young air crew, all the B-52 crews in the Air Force, what would you want to tell them about the mishap?
Well, to be honest, I would tell them to read the book because I relied on the experts of that field. I just guarded the airplanes, so I relied heavily on the pilots that I interviewed and the interviews that I found in that report of investigation. I'm not an expert in aviation, but...
And we agree, by the way. I'm a big fan of your book. As I was reading your book, one of my recurring thoughts was like, this guy thinks like us. This is the exact message that we are trying to get out as Tactical Tangents about taking responsibility for your career, taking responsibility for your tactical abilities, and going out and training and learning and get aggressive about being good at what you do. And so as I was reading your book, that was kind of the message I took throughout was, yeah, we absolutely need to get guys out reading your book.
Awesome. Yeah, I could recognize the necessary and important information in the reports and the interviews that I found, and I knew that I needed to put that in the book, but I'm not the expert, so I really don't want to be giving out the advice to air crews. Unless they want to carry a gun, then I'll tell them what to do.
Well, so
I do.
So what about if we were to just talk more generally about how do you deal with a person that you work with who's a problem like that? And I know we had a similar question talking about Dean Melberg, but in case we didn't mention it earlier, that's the name of the shooter at the Fairchild incident. But as far as the B-52 thing goes, if you're dealing with a coworker or someone who's inherently unsafe and you've taken it to your bosses,
type.
Yeah, and you've taken it to the bosses and the bosses are like, nope, he's fine, you're still going to have to deal with it. Do you have any advice on how to, I mean, and granted we can take it out of the just aircrew context, but just in general, someone that you don't feel safe working with that you're kind of forced to? I mean, what do you think how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's similar to a person that you think might be a threat of violence in the workplace, but just take it to your superior. If you don't get the response that you think you should or that you think is warranted, then you need to take it up the chain of command. There's some people who questioned why the aviators, the air crews, didn't go above the base command and go to like the inspector general and such. So I would say don't stop until you get the results that you want if you are that sure of the danger. But I also understand that the Air Force has changed some policies to where anybody on an air crew can either volunteer themselves and say, I'm not fit to fly today, and or vice versa. They can report on somebody who they don't think is fit to fly, and that action will be taken a lot more swiftly than it was back then. I hope that the climate has changed, but to go back and just reiterate, take it to your superiors, and if they don't act like you think they should and respond appropriately, then just keep going up the chain.
And I can say from personal insight as an Air Force aviator that for the most part that is true. If you say I'm not good to fly, they'll respect that. And if everyone else is saying, hey, that guy's not good to fly, for the most part the Air Force will respect that, with some exceptions, and I have seen some exceptions. One of the most frustrating and heartbreaking things was seeing a C-17 have a very, very similar mishap preparing for an air show just a couple years ago. But it turns out that despite all the lessons we have learned, we still haven't rendered human error out of flying and the mishaps.
Was that the one that occurred in Alaska in 2010? Yeah.
Correct.
I mentioned that in the book as well, that the lessons hadn't been learned yet. Hopefully they have now.
Yeah. I want to say thank you on behalf of our project for coming on with us. And I'm a believer in your book, and I'm a believer in your messages. I really do think that everyone needs to go see that and read it. I did the audiobook, and I really liked the audiobook through Audible. But read it any way you need to, but do definitely go read it.
Awesome. Sounds good. If you are on base or even in your town, you can request it through your local library. They can order a copy, and or your bookstore or Amazon. But either way, it's good information in there, and it could save lives.
I definitely believe in that, Andy, and that the information in your book could absolutely save lives. Aside from the fact that these are stories that needed to be told, which they absolutely are. If there was an overarching message or takeaway that you wanted someone to take from the work that you put into the book, what would that be?
It would be, like I said earlier, that these things can happen to you, not frequently enough to where you need to worry about them or stress about them, but just be aware that it could happen to you and don't live in denial, and just be prepared to respond just in case. If you find yourself worrying about it, then you need to maybe seek some counseling or something, because it's not something that we should be having affect our mental health. But the other thing would be regarding mental health. If you're having a problem dealing with some mental health issues or stress-related issues or recovering from a trauma, don't be afraid to seek help, because not everything that you try is going to be helpful. But if you keep looking, that there is something out there that will be beneficial, and it can and will get better as long as you keep fighting and looking for an answer and solution to your whatever your symptoms or whatever you're dealing with. You're not alone, and other people have been there. So just keep looking and seeking greater peace.
Yeah, I know after reading your book and hearing what you've said to us tonight, that your actions that day definitely came at a price. But I sincerely appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about it. And your actions that day were really putting your money where your mouth is, and that's all the people that talk a good game about we're here to protect people, we're here to save lives. I can tell that you put in the prep work that you needed to be ready to perform that day. I'm a big fan of when I teach, especially cops and stuff. I teach them, when the time to perform arrives, the time to prepare is past. And I can tell that you put in the work, and it paid off. And I have no doubt that you saved who knows how many lives that day. So I'm glad you were there.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you, sir.
All right, guys. Thank you. Keep in touch.
Hey guys, just a quick note before you go. I just want to remind you that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. You can interact with us by emailing info@tacticaltangents.com or find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @TacTangents. Also, if you happen to be in the Seattle area, Andy Brown, the gentleman that you just heard from, is helping with an active shooter interdiction course at the Firearms Academy of Seattle with Marty Hayes. So be sure to look that up if you're in that area and you want more information from him. As always, be sure to like and share with your friends if this is something that you're into. And again, reach out to us. We'd love to interact with you. And that's all we got. Take care.